Praise be Jesus and Mary. Now, if anyone wonders what exactly constitutes a saint, all they have to do is read the life of St. Peter Claver. This holy Jesuit was fortunate enough to have St. Alphonsus Rodriguez as his novice master. The two would eventually be canonized together by Pope Leo XIII in 1888. At one time, St. Alphonsus learned from a vision that this novice was destined to save a multitude of souls in the New World. He said to Peter, how many peoples go astray for lack of ministers? The fatigue of going to seek them out is dreaded. But, not the danger and crime which it is to abandon them. Eventually, St. Alphonsus revealed St. Peter's divine calling to him, just in order to inspire him to an active desire to respond to the explicit will of God. In 1610, St. Peter landed in Cartegena, which is now modern-day Colombia. By this time, the slave trade had been established in the Americas for nearly 100 years, and Cartegena was the chief center for it. 10 to 12,000 slaves poured into the port each year after crossing the Atlantic from West Africa under conditions so foul and inhuman that an estimated 1/3 of the passengers died in transit. Although the practice of slave trading was condemned by Pope Paul III and later labeled a supreme villainy by Pius IX, it continued to flourish, just as contraception and abortion flourish today. I guess if there's a buck to be made or a passion to be satisfied, the Pope takes a back seat. Anyway, after St. Peter's ordination in 1616, he dedicated himself by a special vow to be the slave of the slaves, an apostolate that was to last for 33 years. He labored unceasingly for the salvation of the African slaves and to the end of the slave trade altogether. As soon as a slave ship entered the port, Peter Claver moved into its infested hold to minister to the ill-treated and miserable passengers. After the slaves were herded out of the ship like chained animals and shut up in nearby yards, he plunged in among them and offered whatever poor refreshments he could afford. He would care for the sick and the dying. He instructed the slaves through Negro catechist before administering the sacraments to them. And through his efforts, 300,000 souls entered the church. He was criticized by some for putting a brown scapular on each one of them before he sent them on their way. But he never lost sight of his converts. When they left the ships, he followed them to the plantations to which they were sent and encouraged them to live as Christians and prevailed on their masters to treat them humanely. His apostolate extended beyond his care for the slaves. He became a moral force and the apostle of Cartegena. He preached in the city square, gave missions to sailors and traders, as well as country missions, during which he avoided the possibility of hospitality from the planters and owners, and he lodged in the slave quarters instead. After St. Peter contracted the plague, in his declining years, he was left infirm and partially paralyzed. So he had himself tied to a donkey, and in that way he went about begging and distributing provisions. He had a rude servant who often neglected and mistreated him. But when his brothers, his Jesuit brothers, offered him another servant, he asked to be allowed to keep the rude one, who treated him far better than he deserved. After 4 years of sickness, which forced him to remain inactive and largely neglected, he died on September 8th, 1654. And the city magistrates, who had previously frowned upon his solicitude for the black outcast, ordered that he should be buried at public expense and with great pomp. 2 years after his death, his body was found intact despite the humidity of the burial site. Miracles abounded there and elsewhere by the invocation of his name. A large church was built in Cartegena in his honor, and he became the second patron of his adopted land, Colombia. He was canonized in 1888 by Pope Leo XIII, who declared him the worldwide patron of missionary work among black slaves. St. Peter Claver understood that service, like distributing medicine and food to his black brothers and sisters, could be as effective as a communication, of the Word of God, just by rather than just mere preaching. Of course, it's well known that actions speak louder than words, and that is the most effective means of evangelization, is our good example. So we can pray to St. Peter that we be that faithful witness. St. Peter often said, we must speak to them with our hands before we speak to them with our lips.